Good. So welcome back, everyone. Last but not least for today, we got Kari Theurer from Trinity College talking on disorder as a dysfunction, adaptationism, and teleology in psychiatry. Kari.
Thank you. So before I get started, I just want to say thank you to the organizers. I know how much work this had to be to move it to an online format, and thank you, and I appreciate that. And thanks too for giving the Americans a later session so that I wasn't, pulled from bed too early this morning. So thank you. Like I said, I do not have slides, so there's nothing for you to look at here. I'm just going to read a little bit and talk through the paper. So the concept of dysfunction plays an essential role in psychiatry, and particularly in analyses and definitions of disorder. Both the DSM and the ICD characterize disorder in part in terms of dysfunction. So the DSM-5's definition of mental disorder reads, and I quote, "A mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. Socially deviant behavior and conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society are not mental disorders, unless the deviance or conflict results from a dysfunction in the individual," end quote. So the definition in the ICD-11 is nearly identical, almost word for word. The idea that disorder must reflect underlying dysfunction is now also built into the National Institute of Mental Health's Research Domain Criteria project. This is a project that the American NIH is undertaking. The goal of that project is to understand the nature of mental health and illness in terms of degrees of dysfunctions in general psychological and biological systems. And what all of these definitions and accounts have in common is that they include, as a necessary condition, the idea that any disorder has to reflect some underlying biological, psychological, or developmental dysfunction. And so my focus today is going to be on this so-called dysfunction clause, and particularly on the idea of biological dysfunction in psychiatry. So as important as dysfunction is in all of those accounts, what they lack is a clear analysis of the concept of dysfunction. And without some sense of what it would mean for a system to be biologically dysfunctional, we don't really have any clear way to distinguish between genuine dysfunction or disorder on the one hand, and functional or healthy variations in how people think, feel, or behave. And I think that's critical for a manual and a discipline that purports to catalog and taxonomize legitimate disorders rather than normal variations in human behavior and mental life. And accounts of dysfunction in turn inevitably rely on a more fundamental concept, that of function, which philosophers of mind and science have written lots about. And philosophers and philosophically inclined scientists writing in psychiatry have already written quite a lot about the concepts of function and dysfunction, and also in medicine more generally. So today I'm going to argue that one particular account of function that is implicit in some of the most prominent accounts of disorder is untenable and can't do the work that psychiatry needs for it to do. And so here's how the rest of the talk is going to proceed. I'm first going to walk through a brief history of the dysfunction clause and some of the concerns that motivated its inclusion in the DSM and the ICD. I'll consider a prominent interpretation of it that we find in Wakefield, Boris, David Papineau, and a few others, according to which mechanisms derive their functions ultimately from natural selection. And then I'm going to argue that attempts to conceptualize disorder as disruption in naturally selected mechanisms are both conceptually problematic and also unsupported by the available evidence. And I'll conclude at the end by suggesting that the problem is a much more fundamental and much older one of locating teleology in the natural world. So on to the brief history of the dysfunction clause. So as I'm sure some of you know, the 1970s saw a significant shift in theorizing about psychiatric disorder, in large part as a response to the rather compelling, I think, criticisms of the profession articulated by Foucault, Saz, and some others. And that resulted in the incorporation of the concept of dysfunction into definitions of mental disorder. So understanding the reasons for that shift, I think, sheds some light on the motivations for the addition of the dysfunction clause into the DSM. And just to be clear from the outset, I think the impulse here is largely good, but it's the execution that's a problem. And I actually think it might turn out to be more dangerous for patients in the long run. And in some sense, that's like the most general way of expressing the thesis of my talk today. So up until the 1970s, the DSM had maintained a largely atheoretical stance on the nature and etiology of disorders. But the addition of the dysfunction clause, I think, is indicative of a clear move toward naturalism about disorder. And that's important in part because it serves to locate the source of the condition within the organic functioning of the person rather than in the environment that they're embedded in. So the case of homosexuality and the controversies surrounding it, I think, make it clear why this is really important to do. So a gay person living in a society that's bigoted against gay people would feel some very real and appropriate distress, perhaps, in response to that fact. But in cases like that, the problem doesn't originate within the person. It's perfectly appropriate to respond that way to those social circumstances. The problem is in the world, not in you, right? And so the inclusion of the dysfunction clause is widely understood to be necessary for grounding judgments about disorder in the organic functioning of the person, in their psychology, biology, or development, rather than on the basis of arbitrary judgments, social preferences, things like that. So the dysfunction clause was also intended to demarcate genuine disorder from, negative and unpleasant experiences that are part of healthy, normal human functioning. So things like grief following death or divorce, the kind of mental response that many of us are probably having to the pandemic. While all this stuff is unpleasant, it's also in some sense healthy and normal and not at all dysfunctional or disordered. And so by this point, disorder and dysfunction are so thoroughly and jointly interwoven into the history of recent psychiatry and in our theorizing about disorder that when Robert Spitzer was charged in 1978 with revising the DSM, which eventually yielded the DSM-3, he remarked that, and I quote, "Our approach makes explicit an underlying assumption that is present in all discussions of a disease and disorder, that is, the concept of organismic dysfunction." And so the profession's thinking hasn't changed all that much about that since 1978. So the idea that disorder reflects some underlying dysfunction is now a nearly universal component of definitions of disorder. So what I'm going to do now is just talk through how function and dysfunction appear in some of these definitions and how we might understand them. So accounts of function and of dysfunction are ultimately dependent on some underlying concept of the fundamental concept of function. Accounts of function in psychiatry tend to fall into two groups that map onto the analyses that we find in philosophy of mind and philosophy of science. I am one of those. So one view that is now most strongly associated with Cummins conceives of functions as any causal contribution that a component makes to a system. And that's the account that is implicit in Ken Schaffner's work. And I'm not really going to be concerned with this view here today. It's the second interpretation that I am interested in for today. According to that second interpretation of function, it's a feature of the natural world grounded in natural selection. So that view is implicit in the accounts of disorder offered by Christopher Borse, Jerome Wakefield, among others. On Borse's account, diseases are disruptions in the natural functions of an organism, and those natural functions in turn are the statistically typical contributions that the trait makes to survival and reproduction. That strategy is also essential in Wakefield's harmful dysfunction account of disorder, which is designed really to strike a balance between accounts that understand disorder as a normative concept grounded in value judgments and accounts like Borse's that understand disorder as purely scientific and value-free, allegedly, right? And it does that by splitting the concept of disorder into two components, one of which is purely normative. So the disorder has to have negative consequences for the person, harm, and one of which is purely scientific, that it has to reflect an internal dysfunction. So that allegedly purely scientific conception of dysfunction is grounded in natural selection. So dysfunction is, and I'm quoting Wakefield here, the function of some mechanism in the organism to perform its function. where function is understood as those mechanisms that, and I'm quoting again, are naturally selected because of the beneficial effects that mechanisms have on the organism's fitness. So by tying function to natural selection, accounts like Wakefield's and Bourse's are committed to what philosophers of biology and mind refer to as the selected effects account of function, according to which the function of a trait is whatever it was selected to do by natural selection. It's a benefit that conferred some fitness advantage, and it's that fitness advantage that explains the presence of the trait in the species. So not just any old thing that a system does will count as a function. It has to be something that the system was selected to do by natural selection. All right, so everything that I've set up to this point has been mostly set up. And so this is where the argument starts. I think there is a big problem with accounts that understand function and thus dysfunction and their inevitably disorder in terms of selected effects. And so I'm going to refer to these as philosophers of biology often do as selectionist accounts. I think the problem is that these selectionist accounts implicitly assume, uncritically and largely without evidence, that the mechanisms that generate non-disordered cognitive, emotional, and behavioral functioning are the products of natural selection. That is, it assumes that most of our brain mechanisms that are responsible for healthy psychiatric functioning are evolutionary adaptations. And here's why I think so. So as I've already said, selectionist accounts of function and dysfunction entail that dysfunction is rooted in the failure of some mechanism to bring about the effects for which it was naturally selected. And likewise, healthy or normal functioning is that in which those mechanisms do, in fact, bring about the effects for which they were naturally selected. And so the biological mechanisms that are generative of or constitutive of the healthy condition and which are prone to dysfunction, yielding the disordered condition, are necessarily the products of natural selection. That is, that they're adaptations. So it's really clear at this point, really important for me to be clear about two things. So first, I'm not talking about the view which some people hold that disorders themselves are adaptive. So I gave a version of this talk once where I talked for an hour, and at the end, a guy raised his hand and said, "Do you really think that depression is an adaptation?" And I said, no, that's not at all what I said. What I am arguing is that selectionist accounts of disorder rest on the presupposition that non-disordered conditions are adaptive. Okay, so I said I needed to be clear about two things. The second is that I don't mean to say that no such mechanisms are adaptive. So certainly some things that our brains do are adaptations. But the very fact that some of those mechanisms are, isn't enough, because an account of dysfunction that's grounded in selected effects generally would have to apply to all or almost all cases of dysfunction. That's just what an account does, right? So if it's to serve as a genuine account of dysfunction and thereby of disorder, it has to either be some conceptual truth about disorder in general, or at the very least, an empirical regularity for which we have really strong evidence. But I don't think we have good evidence to think that either of those things are true in this case. And in fact, I think the view should only sound compelling to the most committed of adaptationists, that is, to somebody who believes that natural selection is the only, or at least the most important evolutionary force to consider. Now, the problem with adaptationism is that it assumes, uncritically and largely without evidence, that natural selection is the primary or even the exclusive driver of evolutionary change. But natural selection is only one of many mechanisms of evolution, and the prevalence of a trait in a population is no indication of its adaptiveness. Traits can't even proceed to fixation in a population in the complete absence of differential selection. So many human traits, even ones that are very important to us, are not adaptations. A great many traits are the products of alternative mechanisms of evolution, non-selective mechanisms. So alternative mechanisms of evolution would include genetic drift, so-called spandrel effects, to use Gould and Lewontin's terminology, pleiotropy, allometry, gene linkage, mechanically forced correlations, so things like chins, developmentally forced correlations like male nipples, or if Lisa Lloyd is correct, female orgasms, exaptations, traits whose origin lies in the organism's bowel plan, so things like bilateral symmetry. So these are just a few examples, and there are lots of others. The important point here that I want to make is that not every trait, and that includes neurobiological traits, is an adaptation. So even when it looks to us from the armchair, like a trait has to have been naturally selected for some function, say like feathers for the purposes of flight, we're often wrong. And the same should go for mechanisms that are relevant to non-disordered mental functioning. So at this point, I want to point out that in her 2002 paper, Disease, Rachel Cooper also points to the importance of non-adaptive mechanisms, but she's making a slightly different point. So her point there is that whether something counts as an adaptation is indexed to time, which it is, and that creates a problem for Boris with distinguishing the relevant contrast classes. And I think she's right about that, but I think the general point undermines the account or any kind of account that relies on selected effects in actually a much more serious and much different kind of way. So granted, none of the examples that I've mentioned are so far of alternative mechanisms of evolution are psychiatric or neurobiological. And one might suppose that a different set of rules applies to the evolution of neurobiological mechanisms, but I think there are three problems with that. First, and most obviously, it would be weird if adaptationism were the right way to think about brains, but the wrong way to think about bodies, because brains are part of bodies. We shouldn't expect that the same set of evolutionary mechanisms would govern both. Brains aren't subject to a different or special set of rules. Second, the adaptationist approach to mental functioning seems to run counter to a lot of our current categorizations. So for example, learning disorders, what DSM-5 calls specific learning disability, like dyslexia or dysgraphia, involve dysfunctions in the ability to read, to spell, do math, produce written language. But it seems clearly mistaken to suppose that those are dysfunctions and mechanisms that were naturally selected because of their fitness enhancing effects. So, and that's because human brains evolved long before written language and math did. And the tools that we need to do those things evolved long before written language and math did. So many disorders involve disruptions in relatively sophisticated capacities, like our understanding of our identity and selfhood. And it seems strange to suppose that those would be capacities that evolved because they're adaptive, given their relative recency and cultural dependency. And at the very least, the evidence for claims like that seems to be sorely lacking. Third, and finally, I think there are reasons to think that an adaptationist approach isn't a plausible approach to somatic disease either. And I think it's easy enough to multiply counterexamples here. So for example, endometriosis is a disorder where the usual mechanisms of menstruation in humans are disrupted. And there are currently lots of active disputes about the nature and cause of that disruption. But the condition of well-functioning menstruation is not, by most accounts, an adaptation. It's a necessary byproduct of the way that the human reproductive system evolved, the way that hormones cycle throughout the month, things like that. And there are many, many instances of somatic disorders that are not instances of some naturally selected form mechanism failing to do what it was designed to do. So, what would I conclude from this? I think that not every trait that is prevalent in a population is there because it was fitness enhancing. And so the fact that these now important brain mechanisms exist tells us nothing directly about why they're there or whether they're naturally selected because of those beneficial effects that the mechanisms have on the organism's fitness. So given the availability of alternative hypotheses and alternative evolutionary mechanisms, I don't think that psychiatry is warranted in building into the definition of disorder that the mechanisms underlying non-disordered mental functioning are necessarily adaptive, at least not without good evidence. And so that evidential piece is what I'm going to talk about next. So demonstrating that a trait is or is not a product of natural selection is not an armchair exercise. It's an empirical question, and there are clear standards of evidence for determining whether or not a trait is a product of natural selection. But demonstrating that empirically is actually really complicated and difficult and can be very messy. But certain varieties of evidence are really important to produce. And so next I'm going to outline those standards and argue provisionally that we don't yet have sufficient evidence to suppose that those standards are met in most cases of the mechanisms relevant to psychiatric functioning. So first, you need evidence that a trait has a heritable basis. That is, that it was passed biologically from generation to generation. Second, you have to determine that there was variation in the environment. That is, that there were phenotypic alternatives in the ancestral population for selection to choose from. Third, you have to show that a trait has a differential effect on fitness and that the ancestral environment really did exert the relevant selection pressures. Fourth, you need a causal explanation that links the trait to differential reproductive success. And then finally, the hypothesis that a trait is an adaptation has to be independently corroborated through experiments that would either experimentally manipulate the environment or the trait itself, and establish that different trait variants are linked to greater reproductive success in different environments. So I'm going to walk through the current status of each of these in some detail, but I'm going to be quick because I know I'm running out of time. So first, consider variation in the environment and differential reproductive success. If a trait genuinely enhances fitness, its frequency in a population will tend to increase, at least in the absence of selection pressure in the other direction. And likewise, the frequency of trait variants that tend to decrease fitness will also decrease. And so here, the prevalence of certain psychiatric disorders presents an obvious puzzle. So if, for example, depression and anxiety really do reflect disruptions in fitness enhancing mechanisms that would otherwise contribute to reproductive success, it's hard to understand why so many of us, especially right now, are depressed and anxious, and why so few of us are happy, calm, and well-adjusted generally. Next, think about heritability and causal mechanism. If the mechanisms that govern healthy psychiatric functioning were evolutionary adaptations, we would expect that we would have identified at least some of the mechanisms that govern healthy psychiatric functioning, the dysfunction of which results in disorder, or that we would have at least made some significant progress in that direction. And we would have also demonstrated that those traits have a heritable biological basis, rather than a social, cultural, developmental, or learned basis. Traits that are not grounded in a heritable biological entity, genes or otherwise, are actually just invisible to selection. There's nothing to select. So the biggest obstacle to meeting these first two evidential standards is that the bulk of current research in psychiatry is not on healthy mechanisms at all, much less on their status as adaptive. So psychiatry just kind of by its nature focuses primarily on disorders and dysfunctional mechanisms rather than the functional ones. And even in the case of dysfunctional mechanisms, the research that psychiatry has managed to produce is not all that suggestive. So there's no shortage of studies that attempt to link disorders to dysfunctional gene variants, but psychiatry has had a lot of trouble linking disorders to biological mechanisms at all, much less to biological mechanisms that were definitively naturally selected. And in many cases, we don't even know which genes and basic brain mechanisms are prone to dysfunction and implicated in disorder, and much less whether or not those were naturally selected. So it's a huge empirical leap, I think, without evidence. Now, one might reasonably wonder whether certain biological structures and mechanisms, things like the HPA axis, present an obvious counterexample to what I've said so far. So the HPA axis is widely thought to be implicated in mood regulation and thus in the development of a wide variety of psychiatric disorders. And so it might be tempting to think that this is a rather obvious case of an adaptive mechanism, the dysfunction of which is implicated in multiple disorders. Now, the HPA axis is certainly important in the etiology of those disorders. I wouldn't dispute that. But whether or not it's an adaptation or the product of natural selection is a totally separate question. Adaptations are always adaptations for something. And if the HPA axis were an adaptation for mood regulation, there must have been something that it did in our evolutionary past that increased fitness. And it must have been the case that mood regulation was the fitness enhancing effect for which it was selected. And that fitness enhancing effect would have to be what explains its presence in us. Now, the problem with armchair theorizing about the origins of the HPA axis is that its mood regulating effects can't fully explain why it's in us, because the HPA axis, and especially the components that make it up, is much older, evolutionarily speaking, than mood. And it was originally selected for a different set of fitness enhancing effects. So at best, it's what Gould and Verbo would have called an exaptation rather than an adaptation. So it's a very old physiological system that plays a key role in mediating organismal responses to change in the environment. And parts of it were present in the earliest vertebrates and would have been selected initially for more basic functions relevant to the detection of environmental change via neurotransmitters and neuromodulators that coordinate behavioral and autonomic responses to stress. It has perhaps been maintained over evolutionary time by selection, but that's not enough to say that it is an adaptation for mood regulation. So as West Eberhard points out, and Wakefield actually recognizes, its adaptive effects on mood regulation specifically would have to be the reason why it's present in us. But that's clearly not the case. It evolved much earlier to do something much simpler. And by the time mood regulation would have appeared on the scene, the HPA axis would have been so deeply ingrained in the vertebrate nervous system that selection for mood regulating effects would have been impossible. And that's just simply because there were no alternatives at that point for natural selection to choose from. So in that sense, I think the HPA axis, while very important, is more like bilateral symmetry than it is like the specialized beaks of Darwin's finches. It's not there because of mood regulation. It's there because it couldn't not have been. It was already baked into the architecture of the human central nervous system. So why does any of this matter? I think it matters insofar as we are appealing to evolutionary evidence in order to draw conclusions about ways we ought to be from the way things are or how they came to be. But by incorporating into psychiatry a set of uncritically accepted adaptationist assumptions and the just so stories that go along with them, we presume that the non-dysfunctional condition is adaptive. But that's not always obviously the case. And building a psychiatric taxonomy on that set of assumptions, especially without the requisite evolutionary evidence that would support it, risks importing into that taxonomy a set of unjust social preferences and practice. That's an old problem of psychiatry's, of course, but I think it's made all the more pernicious by dubious claims about the ways that demarcating health and disorder are grounded in facts about evolution that are allegedly purely scientific. So consider what these kinds of explanations would look like for an earlier version of the DSM. It's easy enough to concoct scientifically dubious just so stories that would explain why gay people, trans people, slaves who ran away from their masters are best understood as having a disorder, or why women who get irritable, tired, and moody around their periods are disordered. Those seem like obviously unscientific attempts to pathologize and oppress entire groups of people, and they are. One way of articulating what has gone wrong in these cases is to think of them as imposing teleology where there isn't any, to claim that these are violations in the natural world, which is patriarchal, heteronormative, and capitalist, right? So pushing back against that requires arguing, as Foucault did, that none of these things are part of the natural order at all. And those more recent attempts to purge psychiatry of teleology are certainly progress, right? But in our current situation, an important piece of that strategy, I think, has to be to push back against the reintroduction of a new and naturalized version of teleology that's crept back in by way of the uncritical acceptance of mistaken ideas about evolution, its mechanisms, and its products. And I think that's exactly what we do when we assume that all of the mechanisms relevant to healthy psychiatric functioning are there because they're adaptive. That things that go wrong in cases of psychiatric disorder are interruptions in our natural and teleologically structured brains, or in the ways that our brains are supposed to have been built. So unwarranted and uncritical appeals to adaptation and natural function in the understanding of disorder, particularly without evidence, I think threatens to covertly reintroduce into psychiatry a particularly dangerous form of teleology under the guise of scientific respectability. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kari. We're somehow running out of time, but I do want to have space for at least 2 questions or so. So Chris, go ahead.
So I'm actually going to let Micah from Boston go first because I saw his hand. I have might be a longer question, and I don't want to dominate things. Yeah.
All right, I'll do my best to keep it short. So thank you for the wonderful talk. I did my PhD in neurobiology and genetics, and I defended in part of my thesis chapter on how regenerative biology is a non-adaptive trait, even though it could have evolved. And boy, I was a minority in a field of molecular biologists. So, and I've even spent some time thinking about, or spent some time in the field of genetics of aging and lifespan. And there people talk a lot about health span. And so this term health creeps in. And I've actually visited Christopher Bohr's a book, and I was very, very excited. And it was a great talk. Thank you. I just had a thought exercise or thought process that I had is, I understand, without going into Ezatu or naturalistic fallacy, can you still have a biostatistical way of looking at distribution without it being adaptive? That you can merely plot out the white swans with the hovering risk of another black one. You could think of empirically what is the distribution, and I'm wondering if there's a hope for value independent yet biostatistical way in which we can navigate words like health. Not necessarily what's necessarily optimal. There could be multiple peaks of, health and optimism, or physiological optimism, psychiatric optimism, but not necessarily the dysfunction has such a negative connotation. But if we could walk away from having sort of a moralistic argument when we look at these words, merely by plotting out our empirical observation.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really thoughtful question. I appreciate it. God. So a couple of things. First, what always happens is that, at least for me, when I'm writing something in philosophy, I have the negative idea first. And then you don't always know like how you could find a way out of the morass, right? So I'm kind of at the point in this project where I'm thinking about the answer to that question, and I haven't settled on anything yet, but I've been thinking about a few different options. So one option would be to do it evolutionarily, but in a more responsible way, like to take the standards of evidence more seriously, and not just assume that everything's an adaptation, and actually invest some time and research money into thinking about healthy mental functioning and what the origins of those mechanisms are. So I think that would be one way of building an alternative taxonomy and definition of disease that doesn't build in some of these mistaken assumptions. The problem with that, I think, is that it would leave you with a DSM that has almost nothing in it, right? So I'm not sure that would be all that helpful. Another way to go about doing it would be to adopt a different conception of function. So I personally am a little bit more sympathetic to the Cummins-Schaffner approach to thinking about function. That would require grounding it in things that are not necessarily evolutionary or adaptationist, which I think would be good. The problem that I see with that, though, is that while the first option might turn out to be too restrictive, that might turn out to be too permissive in ways that I wouldn't like, because according to Cummins, anything that a system does, or anything that a component of a system does, counts as a function. And so if you're willing to be that generous with the assignment of functions to systems and to parts within those systems, that would require probably counting lots of things that I wouldn't want to count as dysfunctional, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah. So those are just things that I'm thinking about. I don't know the answer to this question, but it's one that I have been thinking about and want to think about more.
Sure. It's sort of on the note of sort of the utility of going this sort of thought process. I guess I'm very empathetic to my psychiatry colleagues and physicians who mean well and don't attach any sort of negative connotation, perhaps, just one from a personal experience, but it does come with that connotation. And to them, it could, again, be just merely empirical. There's a distribution, and the dysfunctional is merely a guidance in which how they can do appropriate prognosis. And if non-adaptively looking at an empirical evidence is helping us, is it time for us to not sort of bicker about the word dysfunction, but our perception of like you said, function, and this seems to hold more promise for me. So, but thank you.
Yeah. So just quickly in response to that, I have another paper out with a colleague of mine by the name of Dan Hartner, and we argued in that paper that psychiatry really has two halves. There's the half that is praxis, what therapists and psychologists do in contact with patients, right? And then there's research, there's psychiatric research, and those two things are very different. And so most therapists, in my experience, people that I know, really don't care about whether or not these things are dysfunctions in naturally selected mechanisms.
Right.
They just think this is a stupid thing I have to submit to an insurance company here in the States anyway, right? And so I think we would do well to maybe split those two halves a bit more cleanly and not import assumptions from one into the other, which is something that a lot of practitioners do anyway. So I'm good with that. Thanks. So do we have time for another question or no?
If Chris can be very quick, then let's go for it.
Yeah, sure. So I very much liked your presentation. One of the things that your discussion reminded me of was a historical debate which occurred, I think, mostly in the British psychiatry and genetics community over the difference between social selection and social causation in terms of schizophrenia and also crime. So there was this big discussion for what went on for almost 30 years about whether individuals become schizophrenic simply because and then are also experience downward social mobility because they are schizophrenic, or rather the environment essentially makes them more schizophrenic over time. And what's interesting is that dispute was never resolved to anyone's satisfaction. There was one side that basically said that the social environment selects upon the individual, and the other side basically said, oh no, it's all about how the environment influences that individual, so that they basically have that trait sort of over the course of their life. That it's not something that's personal, but it's something that's environmental. And it was interesting talking about going through your discussion how really many of the lines are still drawn now, given between sort of social selection and social influence models of disease and social mobility even now. And my other comment is if you're a behavior geneticist, it's the idea that if you're a hammer, everything is a nail. So depending on who you are and what kind of thing you're interested in, if you're a behavior geneticist, you're going to find genetic, a genetic basis for these things. Or if you're more interested in the biology of psychopathology, you're going to be more biologically inclined versus someone who's social. But I don't know if you've looked at any of the kind of more historical debates about social selection versus social influence.
I have, yeah. And I think like the kind of thing that you point out about debates about the etiology of schizophrenia, I think appear with lots of other mental disorders, right? So it's the same story over and over again, but nobody thinks to ask what's actually going on here. What I'm worried about is kind of papering over real significant social problems that cause very big problems in people's quality of life, particularly here in the States. We have a lot of social problems. I don't know if you guys have noticed. By assuming that they are dysfunctional things in a person's brain. And I think that's like really dangerous and provides certain groups with reason to avoid addressing those social causes because they assume, and our profession has built into the idea that they're natural and they're not. So I think in that debate about schizophrenia and also lots of other places with depression, anxiety, like that, addiction is a big.
Right, and my contention that social genomics is basically introduces a kind of quietism regarding social programs.
Yeah,
whereby if it's genetic, why bother? And yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I do like your criteria of whether you can naturalize these things, because I don't think those any behavioral trait will ever meet those criteria, and I think that's good. I think generally we know more about social causes and social effects than we do about genetic effects, genetic causes and genetic effects. And I think if we have a social explanation, for a social phenomenon, we should stick with that one. It's what I call my principle of biological minimalism. Only reference biology if you absolutely have to, because usually you have a social cause which explains what you're looking at much better than a biological one. Although, since we're being recorded, that's a conjecture more than anything else.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. I have to say, this is really fun. I have had some unpleasant Q&A sessions in my day, and this was really nice. And I've appreciated all these questions. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Kari, once again. Thank you all for being with us. Thanks to all the talks, to all discutants, everybody who stayed with us. Our greetings to everybody beyond the Atlantics, and you guys go voting. Take care.
See you tomorrow.
Tomorrow.